Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today for the virtual reading group. We are continuing to discuss Eichmann in Jerusalem. We're in for a roller coaster today. For those of you who haven't read the material, those who you have, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. We're reading chapter 7, which has the somewhat deceptively calm title, the Wannsee Conference or Pontius Pilate. I assume some of us have some sense of what both these things are. The Wannsee Conference was a conference in January of 1942 in a suburb of Berlin, uh, um, led by Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the Reich Security main office, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, and it included many of the leading, what we would call undersecretaries of different divisions. So the big takeaway from the Wannsee conference is that while many of the top Hitler ministers had already known of the final solution late in 1941, and it had already started to be implemented in certain places, there were a number of what we would call today high-ranking civil servants, people who were not necessarily party members. So therefore, on the outside of the onion, if you're looking back at her analysis of the party from Origins of Totalitarianism, who it wasn't quite clear how they would react to the decision to move from um, uh, forced emigration to expulsion to now killing. And this was a conference in which these civil servants were brought, um, and uh, and where the final solution was presented to them. Eichmann was one of them. He was the lowest ranking person by far. He was the person who sent out the invitation, prepared the slides presentation, or the numbers and charts for Heydrich, who was running it, and to some degree he was something like the secretary for it. But he also was there because he was the head of the RSHA Department 4B4 for Jewish Affairs. And so, you think you're going to get somewhat of a historical account of the Wannsee Conference. It's a very important um, uh, happening in the history of the Holocaust. But really, there's only a couple pages on that in this chapter. It's not the core of the chapter. Pontius Pilate was the governor of the Roman province of Judea in shortly after the birth of Christ. And he's, of course, best known for being as the governor, the sort of judge who presides over the trial of Jesus and orders him to be crucified. And is famous for, saying or exclaiming, "Who am I to judge? If the Jews want to kill Jesus, then let them." Um, uh, this claim, the Pontius Pilate claim, it gets closer to Arendt's real interest in this chapter, because she's interested in Eichmann and his claim that what he experienced at the Wannsee conference freed him from guilt, right? Um, that's the key, is to understand that what Arendt is here after is the way that Eichmann, going to the Wannsee conference, came away from it saying, holy cow, all these people who are my educational, social, military betters, people who are much higher up than me, much more educated than I am, much better thought of than I am, people I have great respect for and always wanted to be like, none of them batted an eye. None of them said, wait, we can't do this, right? Um, and she says that that experience sort of led him to his Pontius Pilate moment. In fact, he himself invoked Pontius Pilate. So on page 114, um, he says that as he saw all these civil service, high level, not even Nazi party members, some of them, high level civil service people vying and fighting with each other for the honor of taking the lead in the final solution in these bloody matters. He says, at that moment, I sensed a kind of Pontius Pilate feeling, for I felt free of all guilt. I felt free of all guilt. To which Arendt adds the obvious, who was he to judge, right? Who was this low-level lieutenant colonel to judge if all these people thought it was okay? Who was he to have his own thoughts in the matter? And then she offers what is one of those, I think, patented Arendtian, simple but withering lines. Well, he was neither the first nor the last to be ruined by modesty. He was neither the first nor the last to be ruined by modesty. Nietzsche writes about something called the pathos of distance in his work, that in order to judge, you need to feel yourself empowered to judge. You, in a sense, need to feel yourself competent or above other people, because if you're going to judge other people, you have to be above them. You have to at least imagine yourself above them. In her book, Responsibility and Judgment, Arendt talks about the fact that you need a certain arrogance to judge. You need to believe that you have a right to judge. Thus, you have to not be so modest. Now, there's an irony, of course, in the statement that he was not the first nor the last to be ruined by modesty. But this is an extraordinary claim of hers. And in a piece I wrote a long time ago, called "Why We Must Judge," I take seriously what I call Arendt's arrogance. Um, you know, Hans Jonas, her good friend, often said to her that, she had an incredible arrogance. She would never, she always, once she made a decision, it was very hard to convince her otherwise. Now, there were times, right, where she was convinced otherwise. So, for example, in this book, she changes her opinion on evil from her earlier opinion. And when Ralph Ellison, the great American novelist, in my view, the greatest American novelist, challenges her on something she says about the parents of Black activists in the 1950s and 60s around the integration of schools in Little Rock. She says, "You're right. I was wrong. I changed my mind." So it's not that she could never change her mind, but she did have a kind of arrogance. I don't want to run away from that. I think she did, and I think that was part of what allowed her to, on the one hand, reach out and try and think from as many perspectives as she could, but at some point make a judgment and stick by it, and say sometimes we have to judge. And here she's saying of Eichmann, and not just of Eichmann, that he was too modest. Now, we're about to get into this chapter. And this is going to sound strange because I think a lot of chapters that we read in Arendt are controversial and difficult. But I'll go so far as to say that this is probably, along with the essay on Little Rock, the most controversial chapter Hannah Arendt ever wrote. As you all know, this book is a controversial book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. If there's a reason for it, it's this chapter. This is the chapter more than any other that she took incoming fire on. And so it's going to get a little bit tense. And I expect some of you will be upset with things she says, and that's fine. I just ask us all to approach it in the spirit of the Arendt reading group and of Arendt herself, which is to listen to opinions we disagree with, challenge ourselves, but then be willing to make our own judgments, whether we agree or disagree. And so you're obviously quite welcome to disagree with me, to disagree with Arendt, to disagree with each other. But first of all, do it in a spirit of learning and listening, and secondly, in a civil way. What is this chapter about? Why am I saying it's so controversial? It's about Arendt's view that what we witnessed in the late 1930s and 1940s was the moral collapse of Western society, not only in Germany, but all over Europe, and not only amongst the prosecutors, but amongst the persecuted. And so this chapter is about collaboration. This chapter is about how Eichmann and people like him were able to turn their conscience around. So last week, we talked about Arendt's question about how long it takes for a conscience to turn around and move from being someone who was deeply appalled by orders to move from expulsion to killing, to being okay with it and saying, well, this is my job, this is my duty, and I have to conscientiously do my duty. And what she's saying here is, not only did it just take 4 weeks, and not only could it happen, but one of the main reasons it could happen is because someone like Eichmann never encountered someone who asked him, why are you doing this? Never encountered people who said, you shouldn't do this. He never encountered resistance. And so the argument here is that we have to take seriously the way that everyone from the top down, from high-level civil servants, who worked for the Germans and the Nazis, to lower-level people, to high-level Jews, to low-level Jews, to people who went into immigration, to people who were even to some degree actively resisting, never said to Eichmann or people like him, you shouldn't be doing this. He never encountered that kind of resistance. And so, in her view, one of the ways that he allowed himself to do this was that he just said, well, everyone else is doing it, and there's no resistance to it. Arendt is going to take that seriously on all levels, but she's going to also take it very seriously amongst the Jews themselves. And that's where so many people, I think, much more so than the question of banality of evil, this is where people really got upset with her and the book. And I think we'll have to talk about it and see what we think. So there's two parts of this chapter, vaguely, one is the discussion of Wannsee and the way that Eichmann never encountered resistance amongst the German civil servant elite. And the second is then the long inquiry into the dark chapter of Jewish cooperation with the Nazis. On page 113, Arendt simply describes the Wannsee conference, talks about how the point of it is to apply the final solution to the whole of Europe. And for that, the Nazis need the cooperation not only of the high-level ministers, as I said, but of the undersecretaries, the people who were not necessarily blood and soil racist Nazis. And Eichmann says in his report that Heydrich, who called the meeting and was his overboss, expected the greatest difficulties. He expected people to resist. And on the contrary, no one resisted. In fact, they all sought to gain power by claiming more and more responsibility for the final solution. Um, the meeting began with complicated legal questions, and maybe that's part of it, is it sort of started in a very bureaucratic way. Who is a Jew? Are half Jews? Are quarter Jews? Who's going to be killed? What are the different ways we can kill them? It was a very technical, bureaucratic meeting. But in the end, the final solution, she says on page 113, was greeted with extraordinary enthusiasm by all present, at which point they broke for lunch and drinks and merriment. Eichmann, she says, had been doing his part on the final solution, but he had still harbored some doubts. But now he encountered the elite of the civil service, and in encountering this elite, what he saw is that they had no problems with it. In fact, that they were just trying to get more responsibility and more power for it. And that it's at this point that she quotes him for saying, "At that moment, I sensed the kind of Pontius Pilate feeling, for I felt free of all guilt. Who are we to judge?" He now becomes an expert in forced evacuations and expulsions, whereas before he'd been an expert in forced emigration. His job is now to contract foreign countries and pressure them to deport Jews. Not only his job, but the job of these undersecretaries, to make Jews stateless so that they can have their property confiscated and no one can inquire after them, to steal their property, to transport them in railroad cars, to create Jewish councils that would inform the Nazis of how many Jews there were and make lists of who should be deported, that Jews should be registered and filled out forms, and that a Jewish police force be created to round up escapees. And again, as she says on page 115, no one protested, no one refused to cooperate. She says mere compliance would not be enough. It had to be not just mere compliance. They actually sought to do the best jobs they could. And as she says, as Eichmann told it, the most potent factor in the soothing of his own conscience was the simple fact that he could see no one at all, who actually was against the final solution. She does say that there was one potential exception, Dr. Kastner, who we've met before, who in Hungary was negotiating with Eichmann for the release of Jews in exchange for some trucks. And he asked at one point Eichmann to stop the death mills at Auschwitz. Eichmann said he can't, and Kastner dropped it. That was the only time in the entire trial record and in the entire account of all the witnesses and all the different documents that were presented in this trial that anyone ever even asked Eichmann, maybe you shouldn't do this, or is there anything you can do to stop it? No one else even asked him. That's what she's sort of just flabbergasted by. And here we now turn on page 117 through 131, so 14 pages, the most explosive, maybe 14 pages in all of Arendt's writing. And it turns around this question of the fact that Jewish cooperation, Eichmann told the court, was the cornerstone of everything. Jewish cooperation was the cornerstone of everything. Arendt takes this utterly seriously, right? It's not just that he couldn't have done his job without Jewish cooperation. It's not just that you couldn't have had so many Jews killed by so few German civil servants, most of whom sat in offices, without Jewish help. It's more than that. It's that they cooperated, and in cooperating, they greased the wheels. They made it easier for everyone to go about their jobs. She also says that it was actually administratively necessary. So she quotes a guy named R. Pendorf, who wrote a book called Murder and Amortita, Murders and the Murderers and the Murdered, in 1961, who says there can be no doubt that without the cooperation of the victims, it would hardly have been possible for a few thousand people, most of whom, moreover, worked in offices, to liquidate many hundreds of thousands of other people. That's a practical problem. She goes into this deeply. She says that the Jewish councils, the Judenräte, which Eichmann and the Nazis helped to create and was a cornerstone of their strategy, were given enormous powers, of course, until they were later deported themselves. All of this was known before the trial. It was a story, she said, that was told fully by our friend Raoul Hilberg in The Destruction of European Jews. And in that book, Hilberg talks about how Jews of all kinds, both from East and West Europe, educated and not educated, assimilated and not assimilated, all cooperated. Hilberg tells this story in detail. We learn in his story, but also in Eichmann's telling, and in the many witnesses at the trial, that Jewish officials could be trusted to complete the lists. To compile. This is on page 118, to compile the lists of persons and of their property, to secure money from the deportees to defray the expenses of their deportation and extermination, to keep track of vacated apartments, to supply police forces to help seize Jews and get them on trains, until, as a last gesture, they handed over the assets of the Jewish community in good order for final confiscation. They distributed Yellow Star badges. They even sold them. What's more, they enjoyed their new power, she says on 118. The Central Jewish Council in Budapest published a circular in which it says, the Central Jewish Council has been granted the right of absolute disposal over all Jewish spiritual and material wealth and all Jewish manpower. Arendt is here, she is opening a scabrous wound. Let's just be honest about this. And she is digging deep. Now, we should say she's not the first person to do this, right? There were trials. Kastner was put on trial in Israel. Hilberg wrote The Destruction of the European Jews, right? Why is the Arendtian version of this so controversial when it's not new? Well, one answer is the statement on page 117, right? Where she says, and this is, I think, one of the most infamous statements in her whole book and maybe in all of her writing. One we'll have to talk about, where she says to a Jew, right? She's a Jew. She's a Jew who escaped, was in a camp, was stateless for 17 years, was a resistance, part of the Zionists. To a Jew, she says, this role of the Jewish leaders in the destruction of their own people is undoubtedly the darkest chapter of the whole dark story. That's not ironic. That's, I think, her stated view, right? Um, now, obviously, people were appalled by this. Some people, not all, some. How can you say that amidst the Holocaust, the darkest chapter to a Jew was the participation of the Jewish people? Um, I think, I mean, I don't, I'm not gonna, I think we're gonna have to discuss that. People are gonna have their own opinions. It's clearly meant to say for her, to a Jew, to her as a Jew. Um, the fact is that Jews made decisions over and over again, the same kind of decisions that Nazis made and civil servants made and Eichmann made to save themselves and some people, even if it meant cooperating with the Nazis to kill many more people. She says they felt like captains whose ships were about to sink and who succeeded in bringing them safe to port by casting over a great part of their cargo, namely other people. You all know, or many of you, I'm sure, know what's called the trolley car problem, right? You know, you're running a train, a train switching station, and a train's barreling down the tracks, and the train is broken, and either it's going to go over one way and kill one person, or it's going to go the other way and kill 15 people or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people, depending on how you want to do the problem. Which one do you pull? Do you save the 1,000 people or do you save the one person? And, you know, the utilitarians who developed this story or this hypothetical always say, oh, you should save the 1,000 people and kill the one person. The moral philosophers say you shouldn't make a choice because making a choice, either choice, is wrong. Where does Arendt stand on this? I think it's clearly on the don't make a choice side. It's also, but this is made easier for her, I think, by the fact that the people who made the choice, the Jewish council leaders, in her mind, chose badly. And so she says on page 118, and whom did these holy principles single out for salvation? Those who had worked all their lives for the community, the Tzibor, the functionaries, the most prominent Jews, as Kastner says in his report. So it's not just that they chose to sacrifice some to save others, but they saved the functionaries. They saved the good people. She'll say at the very end of this chapter on the last lines, they were proud that they saved people like Einstein, right? But they should have been upset, she says, that it was a much greater crime to kill little Hans Kohn from around the corner, even though he was no genius. It was this willingness to say that it's the good people we should save, the Zionists, the smart, the connected, the rich. I think it's that almost as much as anything else that really infuriated her. And so she talks about some of the different, what she calls them, physiognomies of the different leaders on page 119 and 120. So you have Chaim Rubkalski, who I think is probably the person she most despises, the eldest of the Jews in Lotz, who named himself Chaim the First as if he were an emperor and issued currency with his own signature and stamps with his portrait and rode around in a horse-drawn carriage, right? You have Leo Beck, a sort of quasi-rabbinical figure, who, on the one hand, believed that Jewish policemen would be more gentle and helpful and make the ordeal easier, easier, and so, in a sense, empowered the Jewish police to round up and kill the Jews who tried to escape. The same Leo Beck also is the one who hid the truth of the death camps from the people in Theresienstadt and other camps, so that, in his words, they wouldn't be burned with the idea that they were being sent to their death. Arendt, of course, didn't see it that way. He did it for her point of view to make it easier to send them to their death and not have to deal with disorder. There were people who she holds up for their morality. None higher than Adam Cherniakow, the chairman of the Warsaw Jewish Council, who she doesn't hesitate to remind us was not a rabbi and was a non-believer, a Polish-speaking Jew and engineer, but who must still have remembered the rabbinical saying, "Let them kill you, but don't cross the line." And Cherniakow committed suicide rather than provide the Nazis with the lists they wanted. You know, is that the right answer, right? Who's right? The people who saved 1,000 Jews, sent them to Israel to build a new Zionist community, or the one who committed suicide? Now, one answer that the utilitarian answer would give is that, well, we should at least try and save some, right? But Arendt is going to say that actually it would have been better for the Jews to not cooperate and not try and save any by cooperating. She talks about a man named Judenrat Pinkus Freudiger, who was the one Jewish leader, Judenrat, Jewish leader, who testified at the trial, and he was heckled by the survivors in Yiddish and in Hebrew at the trial. Pinkus Freudiger is one of the people who made the lists and cooperated and sent them to the Nazis to help them with the deportations. And he justified himself at the trial as he was being heckled by saying 50% of those who tried to escape were captured and killed. So he said, I was doing a good thing by not encouraging them to try and escape. To which Arendt answers, 90% who did not try and escape were killed. She then backs this up with evidence from a scholar, Dr. L. de Jong, from the Netherlands State Institute for War Documentation, who did a study and said that 103,000 Jews were deported from the Netherlands, and only 519 returned, which is, well under 1%, or no, or at least under 10%, under 1%, I think. And in contrast, only 10,000 of the 20 to 25,000 Jews who tried to escape and went underground survived, which is about 45%. So she actually says that it's not just that cooperation was immoral. It was actually that it led to the deaths of many, many more Jews. And she concludes this inquiry on page 125 to 126, where she says, I have dwelt on this chapter of the story, which the Jerusalem trial failed to put before the eyes of the world in its true dimensions, because it offers the most striking insight into the totality of the moral collapse the Nazis caused in the respectable European society, not only in Germany, but in almost all countries, not only among the persecutors, but also among the victims, right? This is, again, why she's doing this. She thinks that we have to understand the way in which the lack of resistance, the lack of questioning was a moral collapse that allowed people like Eichmann to turn his conscience around. That's the argument here. And she's saying that, she then says on page 126, this is an insight that I think is one of the most powerful insights in the book. And I think one that everyone today around the world, but especially in the United States right now, should be ruminating on. She says that Eichmann saw all those around him either overjoyed and exuberant, like the Nazi civil servants, or cooperating like the Jews. And so on page 126, she says, what he fervently believed in up to the end of the war was success. The chief standard of good society as he knew it, success. Typical was his last word on the subject of Hitler, whom he and his comrade Sasson, Wilhelm Sasson in Argentina, whom he and his comrade Sasson had agreed to sure out of their story. Hitler, he said, may have been wrong all down the line, right? Eichmann knew that, okay, by the time he's saying this in the late 1950s and now 1960, yeah, okay, I understand Hitler was wrong. He may have been wrong down the line, but one thing is beyond dispute. The man was able to work his way up from Lance Corporal in the German army to Führer of a people of almost 80 million. His success alone proved to me what I should subordinate myself to this man. Think about this in context of politics today. I may know that this man is wrong and a liar and evil, but he's successful, and that's worth something. In many ways, that is what Arendt thinks is the ultimate motivator of Eichmann, right? We've talked about what's Eichmann's ideology. Was she wants to say is he wasn't like this crazy, mouth-foaming, evil person. What he believed in was success, was winning. And I think you've heard that a lot in the last 5 or 6 years of American politics. She ends by talking about three other potential responses besides cooperation and outright resistance to the Nazi in the Nazi period. One is inner immigration, where people simply went into inner immigration. Unfortunately, she said, most people who say they went into inner immigration didn't. And she offers the example of Dr. Otto Brodfisch, who said he was inwardly opposed, but presided over the killing of 15,000 people. And she says this is a joke. But she says there were some people, and obviously the prime example here is her friend and mentor, Karl Jaspers, who lived for 12 years in the outer cold as an outcast. And she says, if you're willing to not appear at all and fully isolate yourself and live a completely private life, you can live a moral life under a regime like the Nazis. A second response is those who argued for the idea of the lesser evil, that they stayed in their jobs to try and mitigate matters. And she offers the example of Dr. Hans Globke. And she doesn't think very much of this argument. She's not a fan of the lesser evil argument. We can come back to that into discussion if you want. And the third is exemplified by Propst Heinrich Gruber, a Protestant minister, part of a small and irrelevant group of persons who opposed Hitler on principle. So you would call it principled resistance. But even this principled resistance of Propst Heinrich Gruber, when he negotiated with Eichmann, he never once, as he said to Eichmann, you shouldn't be doing this. He negotiated with him. He tried to work with him. He tried to get things from him and give him things. He never said, stop. He never put his life on the line to say, stop, Arendt is saying. And she's not going to say he's a coward because he did get arrested and he was in a camp. But she is going to say that she says he spoke in cliches. He said words would have been useless. Well, she says, before you say words would have been useless, try them. And that the problem is, as she says on 131, Eichmann can say Nobody came to me and reproached me for anything in the performance of my duties. Not even Pastor Gruber claims to have done so. He came to me and sought alleviation of suffering, but did not actually object to the very performance of my duties as such. Everywhere, she says, people accepted privileges. People worked with Eichmann. No one said, you're doing something wrong. And this was the real tragedy. This was for her the darkest moment of the whole dark story. Now, that's a statement that, I don't know. I have to say, I've taught this book many times. I buy and I largely agree with Arendt's analysis here, which doesn't mean it's right. I'm just telling you where I come from. But I find that statement to be one that I have a hard time squaring with myself. Doesn't mean it's wrong or right. I'm just telling you where I come from. Um, uh, in any case, this is what is this chapter an indictment of? It's an indictment of cooperation, and not only cooperation, but cooperation for privileges, cooperation for benefits. It's about the moral catastrophe that teaches us to negotiate with evil instead of risking our lives to call it out. Now, one thing I just want to add is I do not think Arendt is saying, when she says that this is the darkest chapter in the whole dark story, I do not think she is saying that the Jews are as guilty as the Germans. She's not saying that. I mean, I'm just very clear. I just want to head that off, right? The Jews were in a different position, right? The Germans could resist and not be killed. If the Jews had resisted, they would have been killed right there, right? But she is saying, so she's not saying the Jews are responsible, but she is saying that it was part of the moral collapse. And it's part of that moral collapse that allowed someone like Eichmann and people like Eichmann throughout the Nazi bureaucracy to do what they do and feel okay in doing it. All right. I see there's a lot of questions. I'm not surprised. This is a complicated, this is a brutal chapter to read. Please do, approach it with generosity of spirit, but again, no problem with being disagreed with or having Arendt disagreed with. In the chat, please be respectful. And if you want to speak, please do. I really do want to hear from people today. And, keep your comments short, but if you just want to say what you think, you can also do that. It doesn't have to be in the form of a question. I think this is one of those chapters that people read and either think yes or no, or I don't know, but I'm happy to hear your voices. Okay. Dina, you're up first. And I'm sorry I spoke so long, but look, it's a complicated chapter and I wanted to make sure I tried to bring out the depths of it.
I wanted to mention one other person Arendt identifies as a Jewish elder in this context, and that's Rabbi Benjamin Murmelstein in Vienna. And the reason I'm bringing him up is that later he became the council elder in Theresienstadt and the only one to have survived. And the second reason I bring him up is because Claude Lanzmann, who of course did the Shoah documentary, issued a documentary about Murmelstein in 2013, which is a 3.5-hour interview with Murmelstein. And in that interview, they talk about this tension between were you a realist who saved Jewish people, or were you a collaborator? And in Murmelstein's own words, I think it's worth to look at this documentary, how Murmelstein himself identifies along the lines that Arendt outlines here, with the exception, I think, that, for both Lanzmann, arguably, and Murmelstein, it was worth it. So it's not that they would have that Murmelstein denies being of assistance, but rather accepts that charge and thinks that it was worth it.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I gave a number of talks in movie theaters when that movie came out. The people invited me. Do you remember the name of the movie? I'm blanking on it.
It's the last of the unjust.
The Last of the Unjust. Yeah, thank you. And it's an extraordinary movie. Again, whichever side you're on, because you have a 3.5 hour discussion with Rabbi Benjamin Mermelstein, who was one of the Jewish elders in Theresienstadt, who survived, right, as a Jewish elder. I mean, in a sense, Arendt writes about him on page 120,
Right.
where she says he could have pointed to the fact that Eichmann, immediately upon being transformed from an expert in immigration into an expert on evacuation, appointed his old Jewish associates in the emigration business, Dr. Paul Epstein and Rabbi Benjamin Mermelstein, who had had the same job in Vienna as Jewish elders in Theresienstadt. You're right. Mermelstein and Landsmann both admit what they did and defend it. And I think, they would say it was worth it.
Mhm.
Obviously Arendt, disagrees with them on that.
Yes.
But that's a question. I mean, again, people say, oh, well, if they hadn't, there would be no Jews who survived. But that's actually not true. And it's not Arendt's argument. Her argument is that's counterfactual. If you hadn't cooperated, she thinks many more Jews would have survived.
Mhm.
The difference is it would have been different Jews.
Mhm.
It wouldn't have been the old and wise intellectuals. It would have been the people who fought and escaped, the average people. And, her view is what Mermelstein and Landsmann are defending is protecting the good society Jews and making a value judgment about which Jews are worth saving and that they should have that choice. And that's what she's opposed to.
It's an extraordinary movie, I think, and Mummelstein addresses all these things in his own words. So if you want to hear from him, watch
No,
it.
it is an extraordinary movie. Like I said, I did do a number of talks on it, and I think, and I encouraged people to see it. I still encourage people to see it. Hannah, I know you'll have something to say here, so I'm looking forward to it.
Ha, ha, ha. Yes. Well, I think I wanted, well, keep it brief at three points. First, I want to sort of offer you a corrective to something you said, which, you talk, first of all, Arendt identifies that the functionaries were the ones who were saved. Okay, the Jewish functionaries, the head of the Jewish Federation, as it were. Then these are not intellectuals. Walter Benjamin was an intellectual. He had to commit suicide because he had no way out. The intellectuals were not saved. Einstein saved himself. He got out much earlier. So I just think you were sort of crossing some lines there. Functionaries were not
Fine. Yeah, I accept that.
intellectuals. Okay, they were the bureaucrats.
That only strengthens her argument from her point, because she has, let's just be honest,
exactly.
she is. She
But I'm
has
just
somewhat contempt for functionaries.
exactly, and so do I. So that is. I just wanted to make that sort of mini point. You're so brilliant in covering so much territory. That was the only thing I ever heard you say that I thought was a little off. Okay, and you recognize it. Secondly, as you know, when we started this book, I said this was the third time I read it, but honestly, her tone just upset me so desperately this time. So just to say, I feel like her tone was absolutely wrong. And also, I have a lot of material from my father who, met with Gruber, met with Heinrich Gruber, and had a very famous meeting with him that you can read about in After Auschwitz. But so I have a lot of primary sources. One thing I'm holding in my hands is from 1963, the Anti-Defamation League, a report on the evil of banality, the Arendt book. And this is Jacob Robinson's sort of answer to her charges. But actually, I think he did a fairly poor job of answering it. It's interesting, you know, about the complicity. But interesting. I wondered if you had it and if you were interested in seeing it. I don't know, but I don't want to go into that because I can't remember. He didn't convince me that much. What I really want, so I thought the tone about the Jewish complicity, one, was really bad, really, really bad, just from a point of view of what had happened. But secondly, I think she did overstate. I do believe she overstated what the Jewish councils were able to control. I remember Robinson saying they were not in charge of giving all property, that that was a real overstatement. So I think, but I don't know the facts right now to argue it. But my question to you, finally, this book, The Judenrat by Isaiah Trunk, I guess came out in 1977, was it? So it came out after she wrote it. And I wondered if you could address The Judenrat by Isaiah Trunk as compared to this chapter, or if that's just totally whatever. And I mean, yeah, so that's about it.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. So I'll go one by one. On the functionaries versus intellectuals, yes, you're right. I mean, it's functionaries. I mean, and by the way, they also saved children, right? So let's be honest. But she is upset that they really did try and save functionaries and their families, which she thought was, deeply unfair. Now, on the other hand, it's hard to blame them. On the second part, a few things. Tone. You think her tone is absolutely wrong. I can't, as she said, when people said that about the book, she said, I can't argue that. She said, my tone is my tone. I'm ironic. It's the way I dealt with it. If people don't like my tone, I understand it, but it's who I am. I wrote it in my voice. And that's, people don't like my voice. And she said, that's their judgment. You did say,
I love her tone. I love her tone in general, and I love her wit and her irony. It's the tone when it relates to the Jews' moral collapse. Okay. Yeah. And I find that people on the left sometimes direct so much more anger towards the victim, if it's a Jew, than towards the perpetrators. For example, anger towards, so there's that in it. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to say that.
So a couple things. One is she doesn't talk about complicity of the Jews. She talks about cooperation, and you talked about complicity, right? I mean, she doesn't believe that the Jews are responsible, and I think that's an important distinction. In her mind, it's very clear. The Nazis are the people at fault here. The Nazis are the people complicit and responsible. She's not blaming the Jews.
But in this chapter, it bleeds both ways.
Okay.
The rest of the book, it doesn't.
I don't think it does in this chapter, okay. But we can disagree on that. Okay. I think in this chapter, what she's saying is she's angry, right?
Yes.
And she's angry at not complicity. She's not blaming them. There's no claim here that the Jews are the person who caused this. The Nazis caused this. Right, let's be very clear. But the Jews cooperated, and that did a few things. Let's just lay them out. One, it saved some Jews and not others. She thinks it saved a particular kind of Jews, not the ones they should have saved.
Right.
Two, it led to more Jews being killed than if they hadn't cooperated.
Right. I think she's right, too.
And I think she's right about both those.
My mother escaped, they left.
I think she's right, too. And three, this cooperation was part of a moral collapse that allowed people like Eichmann, who were not crazy, nutty people, to continue thinking, oh, everyone, good people, even the Jews are working with me on this.
Oh, he's a psychopath.
Well, fine. But the point is, he never encountered anyone who pushed back.
Yeah, but
And
that's no excuse, and I can't bear it being offered as
she's
one.
not offering it. I don't think, look, she thinks he should be hung, right?
I mean, what person doesn't have a conscience that would say, oh, let's murder, 9 million Jews, like la-di-da, as long as nobody says it's bad, well, I'm cool.
You're right. But she's not using it as an excuse. She's using it to try to understand. And what she's saying is we have to understand that one of the reasons he and other people like him could do what they did is because they never encountered people saying, stop, what are you doing? This is wrong. Now, maybe if they'd encountered that, they would have just shot them and moved on.
Yeah.
But the more people you encounter who say that, the harder it is to do that. And that's her argument. I think
Right.
I think it's an argument that I happen to think is probably true, but that doesn't mean you can blame individual Jews for cooperating. The decision each one made in general is, was an impossible situation. Do you save yourself or do you, commit suicide? I don't think she blames individuals, but I think, she does blame Leo Beck, and she does blame, Chaim the First. And, but I don't think she blames most of the Jews in the camps who cooperated or whatever. She understands the difficult decisions all of them had to make. And so I don't think it's about complicity. I don't think it's about blame.
Okay.
But I do think it's about this. I don't know, the ADL report, and I'm someone who has a close personal relation to the ADL in my life. So I've always been someone who respects the ADL. I mean, I think the 1963 report by Robinson is a disaster.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of it.
Yeah.
I haven't read the book you mentioned, the
Judenrat.
Judenrat by Isaiah Trunk. I don't know it. Again, nothing she says here about the Judenrat is that controversial. On a factual basis, she takes it largely from three sources. One is Raoul Hilberg. The other, I haven't mentioned it yet, but the book by the amazing German writer, novelist, and historian and survivor, H.J. Adler. And if, the book he wrote, Theresienstadt, which was published, I think, 1956, no one translated it for over 50 years because it was one of those books that people like the ADL didn't want us to read because it provided so much information about collaboration. And it was finally translated under the auspices of my friend Amy Blauenweiss, who's now teaches at Bard, and there's now an English edition of it, which came out a few years ago, and is worth reading. And then the third source is just the trial, which had a lot of information about this. All right. I'm going to move on, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hold on. Who's next? Stephen.
Hi, Roger.
Yes.
I'm one of the people who took great exception with her tone, which I felt, as you point out, was maybe infected by her anger and her hatred for certain individuals, and certainly somewhat of the Zionists. But I think her crime in this chapter is an omission. And in fact, you just touched upon Adler's book. Do you remember the full title of the book?
I think I have it, but I don't remember it offhand. The thing is called Theresienstadt 1941 to 1945, but maybe I'm mistaken.
Theresienstadt 1941, 1945, the face of a coerced community. So throughout your extensive preamble with regard to, and I think defending Arendt's position in the book and in the chapter, not a mention of the word of coercion. And I think that her omitting the full title, if we, instead of saying cooperation, we use the word coercion, it changes the entire dialogue. And that needs to be taken up. And just so we're on the same page, let's look at the definition of coercion. I think this little definition and its comparison with cooperation hits the spot. The quote, coercion is the Hobbesian solution to compliance problems and rests on the state's monopoly of violence and its coercive and repressive apparatus. Cooperative strategies, on the other hand, instead strive for devolution of power and for a high level of citizen participation in decision-making. So to say that these Jewish elders, functionaries, whoever, are in the position to be citizens and participate in the decision-making when they knew maybe it would lead to their deaths or the deaths of their loved ones, doesn't take in this notion of coercion. And it seems that Hannah Arendt has this penchant for controversy with the people who she's using as sources. So I'm sure you're familiar with that there was a controversy around the Adler book, and that Adler took great exception with Hannah Arendt's position. Could you maybe inform that? Because I know that you're aware of the English translation because you're mentioned in the acknowledgments of translators. And so that's one point I want to make. Do you want to address that now?
I don't remember. I don't know if I do. I've forgotten what Adler said about Arendt. I mean, so if you want to tell me what she said, I can address it, but I don't have the memory of it.
Well, she first of all, she called Arendt out with regard to the awareness of the book. So Eichmann read the book, so he and his defense team would have been aware of the book. He read the book to refresh his memory, and Adler had approached and was a secret consultant for the prosecution at the trial. So the book wasn't repressed. So Adler took exception with that. And then he remained silent, and then he came out later. I mean, the controversy around the book is in his book, or actually is a comment. It's an afterword by his son, takes up the dynamics. It's very complex. I don't have time to get into it now. I want to go on to the next point that I'd just like to make, because
All right, quickly, Stephen.
yes, I understand that. So I just want, you may or may not be familiar with an article by Saul Stern in the City Journal, Hannah Arendt and the Origins of Israelophobia. And he's a critic, and he says in that article, years later, Arendt pilloried European Jewish leaders facing the Nazi murder machine for their pathetic behavior. But Stern accuses, quote, but what did she do for the cause of rescue while living safely in the United States? Turns out that she didn't use her platform of the Aufbau and her access to influential journals and platforms to argue for what other Jews in the community were arguing for, which was a rescue effort. The Berkowitz group argued for rescue, and Stern says Hannah Arendt was AWOL during the desperate 2 years from 1942 to 1944.
Stephen, I'm going to stop you there because I think I don't know who Saul Stern is, but that's simply slanderous and wrong. And I just want to just respond to that very quickly. I mean, what did she do? She spent 7 years in Paris, where she helped save German children, bringing them to Israel through the Youth Aliyah,
Right.
and took them to Palestine. She worked for Jewish causes throughout that time. She came to the U.S., and as you said, she worked with Sal Baron, and she also worked in Aufbau, and she called in article after article after article for a Jewish army to go and fight the Nazis, and argued and called for people to fight against the Nazis. In fact, she thought that people who called for rescue were, you know, I mean, she's not against it, but she thought that that was a cop out. She thought that the way to fight, that Jews should fight for themselves and respond. So to say that she was AWOL and did nothing at this time is, I think, simply I mean, this is, I mean, this is the problem is
Okay.
you have people
Roger,
like
can
this.
I respond a little so we can have just a little bit of a dialogue here? I'm sorry, but you have the microphone. I appreciate that you have the microphone and you have control of the forum here. But there's an onslaught that you provide of all these, of this defense. Stern's article, I just quoted a sentence. It's very well researched. He presents context, which you're not acknowledging here. I'll send you the article and maybe you can respond in more thorough way. I'm trying to make the point that you need to see Stern's argument or comment in the context of those 2 years, what she was doing with her platform, in the context of her accusations against these elders. Why can't we turn the finger around and accuse her? What did she do? And so calling for a Jewish army while most of European Jewry was enslaved, was in these camps, in the concentration camps, a little late for that. And so, and certainly not something that the leadership could have organized on the spot. So I think we have to look at that because she's judging these people. You know, and the convolution, the intellectual games, the omission, putting the word coercion in there, with not addressing that in the context, what's going down. I just think that if we're talking about emotional triggers, I think that's the crime here for the other side. And I can appreciate your defense of her.
I'm not. Look, I don't want to name. I've been very clear that I think what she said is controversial and debatable. But I don't like it when people.
Debating it.
I don't like it when people slander people and say things that are simply not true. And unfortunately, there's an entire industry of Arendt haters out there who are doing that, and Saul Stern is one of them. The point is that she does acknowledge coercion, right? Fully.
Can I say
No, Stephen, you've spoken for a long time. I'm going to take your argument and I'm going to answer it. She fundamentally acknowledges coercion. She understands that you can't judge people individually in these ways. But you know, and she doesn't blame them for what they do. She's not out there prosecuting people, but she does think that there was a culture of collaboration on all sides by Jews, by Gentiles, by Germans, by French, by Dutch. It was almost universal. And she says, look, yeah, the Jews were in a much harder position than the Gentiles, and they were in a much harder position than, you know, than the Nazis. And so, yeah, she understands that. That's there. But she does think that there are lines one doesn't cross. And she thinks too many people across the world cross those lines. Now, you know, what could anyone, what should she have done? Should she have gone and fight? Should she have taken a bomb and try? You know, I mean, you can always say this stuff. What she's trying to say is, look, there are moral lines one shouldn't cross. And this period in history led to it becoming common sense for people to cross those lines. And she thinks that was one of the great tragedies of this period, and that it's one of the reasons that people like Eichmann could justify what they did. This is not a claim to say that Jews who were in a camp and sought to keep themselves alive are bad people, or that we blame them. She says, you know, if I, you know, who knows, you know, these are situations where everyone has to make their decisions, but she's talking about a culture of collaboration that she thinks was devastating. And I mean, there are a few people she does name, right? But most she doesn't, and she's not trying to blame individuals. And I don't think we need to sit there and sit in judgment of individual Jews, including her. So
okay, I'll stop by just asking you a question, and then I'll shut up. So in other words, if she's not blaming these people, as you just said, she's not blaming the Jews. She should have put it in this chapter. She should have definitely said that, because the whole chapter comes across as she is blaming. She's blaming the victims here for being in the position that they're in.
You know, I don't think she is, but that's okay. We can disagree on that.
That's good.
George.
Sure. One clarification and two fast points, I hope. One is Adler only became widely read after Sebald used them in Austerlitz. He used that whole section in Austerlitz. And number two, he was really arguing not so much with Arendt as with Adorno, because Adorno wouldn't help him out when they were in England. So that's number one. Number two is as far as Eichmann is concerned, I just want to something just very briefly is that what Gombrowicz wrote. And he wrote, against Camus insisting that the individual conscience serves as a stop, he writes, don't we see that conscience has no voice in the matter? Does man kill or torture because he has come to the conclusion that he had the right to do so? He kills because others kill. He tortures because others torture. The most abhorrent deed becomes easy if the road to it has been paved. For example, in concentration camps, the road to death was so well trodden that the bourgeois, incapable of killing a fly at home, exterminated people with ease. So I think that's all I have to say for the Eichmann business with the conference, because the thing is, this happens over and over in the world. And the final thing I have to say is, you know, as a refugee myself, as a kid refugee, and having lived with a lot of smart Polish refugees, the thing about Hannah Arendt's tone is really something that one of my relatives said. Women said, "Who does she think she is?" In the sense that you know, she's doing a what if thing. What if I were there? I would have fixed this in a much different way. She wasn't there.
Yeah.
Wasn't there. And if you read something like Chaim Kaplan's diary, you know that this is old stuff with the refugees. They were accusing each other of all sorts of collaboration all the time.
Yeah.
And they were talking about Rubinstein, the clown in the ghetto, and the Ghetto 13. This is the Warsaw Ghetto, who were hoodlums, who were, this is nothing new. And all of a sudden, I think she found herself an audience that has really sacralized, sanctified the Holocaust. And she found that audience, and it was an easy audience to shock. The refugees weren't shocked by any of this.
So I don't think she's, you know, again, this is just, I don't think she's saying if I were there, I would have done differently. She, in fact, says, you know, who knows? We all, in these kind of terrible situations, we never know how we're going to act. But what she is saying is this kind of culture of collaboration was infectious and spread throughout Europe. It started with the Nazis, and yet it destroyed and upended the very foundations of Western morality, which is that there are lines you don't cross. That was her claim. You know, whether you think there are such lines and whether we should, you know, like, you know, there's a famous case that, you know, I'm a lawyer, you know, of some kind, and we used to teach this case in law school, where there's a shipwreck and the people are in a lifeboat, and you know, they're starving, and after like 2 weeks, you know, one of them decides to draw straws and decide to kill whoever, you know, gets the short straw. And, you know, they do, and they eat the kid, and then they're rescued. And, you know, they're put on trial, and the guy says, look, who wouldn't have done this? And the judge says, you're right. We may have all done it, but that doesn't mean it's right. And we're still going to prosecute you and convict you. You know, I think in some way that's the attitude Arendt is taking, that it's not that, you know, I'm holier than thou and I would have done it, but it's that we have to, in thinking about it, we have to think about how it is that it became common sense for people to think to imagine that cooperation was better than holding up an ideal of what is right. And that's what I think she's writing about.
Yeah, one fast point really is, again, when you're talking about Chernakov, just to show you the difference between people who say, well, we're sort of in the know, we knew all this stuff. Both Marek Edelman, a labor Bundist, and Zuckerman, a Zionist, who were Warsaw fighters, didn't like what Chernakov did, killing himself, because they think he should have told the people what's going to happen before he killed himself.
Yeah, I mean, look, you can, everyone can be, criticized or in different ways. All she says about him is there's something to be said for not crossing a line, and that's the position she's at least trying to say, that it existed. People could have done it, and yet almost nobody did.
Okay.
Haley, yeah.
Hi, let me get my camera on. I've just got, I don't think I have a question, I just have thoughts which I want to say out loud and see if they make sense. And I think for this, I'm trying to square off what Arendt is saying, but kind of like in the context of her other writings as well. So I'm thinking about origins of totalitarianism and also the human condition as well. And I can hear her absolute fury in this chapter, but I think for me, it's just fury at the world, absolutely furious at the world, and furious rather than fury at her fellow Jewish people, or I think that seems to be where it sits with me. And when she talks about the darkest chapter, so this being the darkest chapter of the whole story for her, I think it's her being heartbroken. I think that's how I read that, and her absolute devastation and her absolute sadness about it. And what's interesting to me is thinking about, as Stephen was saying about this, about coercion, and I think that's at the heart of this. And maybe it'll come out later in the book, but there seems to be in here like these kind of snippets and clues of how Arendt, I think, is saying this is where totalitarianism starts from. It's about kind of it's coming from the loss of individuals and kind of the upspringing of like a common good, or like a common good society, or a common culture, or this kind of. And then I was thinking it's like this hive thinking, and then I was like, well, actually, it's like hive mind non-thinking. I think that's what she's saying is happening here, and and from this kind of these hive minds and this kind of common non-thinking, then you end up with loss of individual power, loss of you just get people that are dehumanized, and people don't think and end up believing that they can't think. So I think there's also a clue in the chapter as well where she uses the word autonomy. So she talks about the Jewish autonomy, and she puts it in quotation marks. And I'm not sure if she's putting it in quotation marks because she's quoting someone who said autonomy. I don't think she is. I think that's where she's saying that it's not real autonomy. It's actually coerced. And I think that's where my thoughts are ending at this point. I hope that makes sense.
So I want to thank you, Haley, because I think you said something deeply important more clearly than I said it, and I appreciate that. I think you're right. What you're seeing here is fury at the world. That's what I was trying to say, but I think you put it better than me. So thank you. There is a fury at the world here that allowed this to happen, in which the entire history of Western morality, which she thinks begins with the Socratic idea that it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong, right? This is one of her common thoughts. And she says, in a sense, that idea that it was better to suffer wrong than do wrong has always been, hard to hold up in practice. And yet it was something that was, it was something that people believed as a
Hmm.
core moral proposition. And when she says things like, the pillars of our tradition have shattered, that's part of what she means, that it's this event convinced people in general, the Nazis, but also the French, and also the Netherlands, the people in the Dutch, and also the Jews, that it's no longer better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. That there is that moral proposition is not only hard to practice, but is no longer right. And there's a kind of sadness, heartbroken is another word you use, but also fury at the way the Nazis destroyed the entire root of Western morality. And I think that's a big part of what she's after. So I think that's what you meant. It's what I took from what you mean. And if that is, I think it was excellently put, and I agree with it.
Thank you. Yeah, that is what I meant. Thank you. I think it's this idea of the moral collapse. I know in the chat people are talking about that, and she says that all the way through. She repeats this moral collapse, and after moral collapse, you get totalitarianism. That's to me. I think that's the journey, and that I think is what she's trying to show us.
Yeah, thank you. Though, first, just thank you. That was a great comment. I do see a lot of people in the chat saying they want to have a glass of wine, and I understand that. So imagine we're all there with you. Bernard.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is my first time reading this chapter. It's a very it kind of leaves you wrecked after reading it. And I've mentioned in the past that I'm coming at this from a non-Jewish perspective. But this same past week, I'm finally getting around to reading A Zone of Interest, or watching A Zone of Interest. And I could not help but see the illustration of the banality of evil as I've been watching that movie. And this concept of the moral collapse, for the last 9 years, I continue to observe people that are observing the moral collapse of the one quarter of America that is evangelical Christian, and people positing the question of how is this moral collapse of that 80% of them that look to Trump not just as maybe a necessary tool to their agenda, but as actually a messianic figure that they've been waiting for decades. And in reading this chapter, I'm left wondering, do I equate kind of the lords of Wall Street as being the moral equivalent of the Nazis, and the American evangelicals as being the functionaries, the common German that empowers these elites? But this chapter has brought up those kinds of questions for me that I'm going to have to process for a while longer. But I wanted to put that out there.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes, and I got some other questions. So I'm just going to let that comment sit because it stands on its own, and ask Vigdis and Lee to make final comments, and then we'll stop.
Okay, I try to be brief. This is something I have been thinking about several times, and it's a bit about it. The book has made me think of it even more, and it's about using quotations from Arendt's writing. And I often do it myself, and I think she has a lot of sentences that is good for quotation. But there's one sentence that have many times worried me, because I'm so afraid of when it's taken out of the context she writes it in, it would be misunderstood. And that's the sentence, there are no dangerous thoughts, thinking itself is dangerous. And I have to admit, it have came up to me several times reading this. And I have it, it's on one of the tote bags. And when I use the tote bags on the shop, I don't dare show that text to people around me. So I have the text towards my body. I'm so convinced that this is taken out of the context, it would be misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a complicated statement. There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. But I think, I mean, I think it's a very meaningful and profound statement of hers. Thinking undoes all moral and traditional certainties, and thus thinking is dangerous. And yet she also thinks that particular dangerousness of thinking is what can save us, because we need to be honest about the ways in which our traditional morality and traditional institutions and standards are failing or are tenuous, and we sometimes need to be willing to tear them down in order to let new ones emerge. And so I think the context of that is extraordinary and worth saying. But you're right, any slogan, including that one, can be misunderstood and can be trite when it's just a slogan, and that's obviously a dangerous of tote bags. And I stand, you're right.
Yeah, because
yeah.
the last part isn't in. I just have one short about distinction. I think it's very important to have the distinction between to understand something is different from defending it.
Yeah.
And it's also different from accusing someone, and also to think about what Arendt says about forgiveness, because you can't foresee the consequences of your acts.
All true. I'm going to give Lee the last word here.
Thank you. I'm actually going to give Hannah Arendt the last word here. I was able to hear her talk and respond to some of the questions that we have addressed in this session. This was at Columbia in 1963 in August, after the book came out, and as people have noted, there was a huge amount of controversy over the role of the Jewish councils. Okay, and Arendt's response, it's not the same response that she gives in the book at the last line about the Germans regretting that Einstein had to be forced out of the country. Her response was that nobody, including specifically the members of the Jewish council, should determine who should live and who should die. Okay, and I've never heard Arendt invoke the name of God. Okay, but she did this at the end of the talk. Okay, and she said only God should have should determine who should live and die, and that Einstein should live and Jaime Cohen should die. And with that response, the end of this hour-long meeting basically came to a close. Okay, so.
And we'll let our hour-and-a-half-long meeting come to a close on that line, because I think it's a great line to end with. So I appreciate that, Lee.
Okay.
I think
Good.
that goes to the very heart of what she's saying, and where her anger lies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Her anger at the world, and at a world in which people think they have the right to make these decisions.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. We for next week, we're going to read 2 chapters, just so you know, the next 2 chapters on, oh no, I'm sorry. For the next week, we're reading chapter 8, Duties of a Law-Abiding Citizen. And I think that that's not correct maybe in the emails you're getting, but I think it is correct on the website. So we're reading Duties of a Law-Abiding Citizen, chapter 8 for next week. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next Friday. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Gracias, profe. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao,
Thank
ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Excelente, Berkowitz. Great.